The Danger of Seeing What Others Don't, Carl Jung. In the quiet of his Zurich office in 1913, Carl Jung sat with a patient who would change the course of his understanding of the human mind. This wasn't someone suffering from madness, delusions, or any obvious disorder. On the surface, she seemed calm, composed, and even gifted. But as she spoke, Jung realized something profound. She saw too much. She could walk into a room and immediately feel what others were hiding. She knew who was angry but smiling, who was sad but pretending to be okay, who was lying, and who was silently falling apart. It wasn't just guesswork or intuition in the casual sense, it was a deep, instinctive knowing. She read people the way others read books. She spoke of others as if she had access to their private diaries, their hidden wounds, their unspoken fears. And, unsettlingly, she was almost always right. At first, Jung thought he was witnessing a rare and extraordinary kind of insight. But then, something else became clear. This insight didn't help her. It hurt her. She was exhausted, isolated, and emotionally overwhelmed. She couldn't keep friendships because people didn't feel comfortable around her. She couldn't work in groups because her presence seemed to disturb others, even if she said nothing. She didn't try to manipulate or expose anyone, but people still reacted as if she were dangerous. Jung realized he wasn't treating a psychological illness. He was witnessing a different kind of suffering, the suffering of someone whose consciousness had gone beyond the normal range. She wasn't broken. She was overly awake. This woman became, in many ways, the first real example of what Jung later called the introverted intuitive type, a personality so rare, so finely tuned, that it bordered on psychic. But this wasn't magic. It was perception so advanced that it processed not just visible behavior, but unconscious patterns. She felt what others couldn't even admit to themselves. As Jung continued working with more people like her, he discovered a pattern. Those who shared this unusual perceptiveness often lived similar lives, marked by loneliness, emotional burnout, and rejection. Not because they were flawed, but because they reflected too much truth. They were mirrors to the people around them, and society does not like mirrors that show what it doesn't want to see. Imagine being able to tell when someone is lying just by how they move their eyes or pause between words. Imagine sensing that someone is depressed even though they're laughing, or knowing that a couple will break up months before it happens because you can feel the tension under their smiles. Now imagine living like this all the time, in every room, with every person. That's what these individuals experienced. Jung began calling this dangerous gift differentiated perception, a mind that perceives not just the world, but the layers beneath it. These people weren't mentally ill. They were mentally exposed, as if they were walking through a storm without any skin. The real problem, Jung realized, wasn't in their perception. It was in how the world responded to it. People don't like to see what they've buried. And when someone reflects their hidden fears, insecurities, or contradictions, they often lash out. Jung called this shadow projection, where people unconsciously blame others for what they refuse to face in themselves. So the person who sees clearly is treated like the problem, not because they cause it, but because they reveal it. Again and again, Jung's patients described being accused of being too sensitive, too intense, or too negative, just for pointing out something everyone else was trying to ignore. A woman would gently say, "You seem upset," and the response would be, "Why are you always starting drama?" A man would mention that someone seemed sad and be told, "Stop being so judgmental." It wasn't the message that bothered people, it was the mirror. Most would rather break it than look into it. Jung saw that this pattern repeated not just in individuals, but in groups. Families, workplaces, and even entire societies have shared illusions, things everyone silently agrees not to talk about. The highly perceptive person unintentionally threatens these unspoken deals. Simply by being honest or noticing what others pretend not to see, they become a threat. Jung understood that societies are held together, in part, by what people choose not to see. And those who see too much become destabilizing forces, even when they mean no harm. But not every intuitive person was the same. Jung noticed that different individuals process this deep perception in different ways. Some felt other people's emotions so intensely, they couldn't tell the difference between their own feelings and someone else's. Others didn't feel as much, but they could see psychological patterns and predict outcomes with surprising accuracy. Some could even sense illness or tension in the body before any symptoms appeared. And a few, perhaps the rarest, just absorbed everything at once, without any way to organize or express what they were experiencing. These were the ones Jung feared for the most. Without the tools to manage their awareness, they lived in constant psychological overwhelm. And so, Jung's discovery became not just a psychological theory, but a warning. He believed that seeing too much, without learning how to integrate that perception, was dangerous. It could lead to deep isolation, emotional suffering, and even social attack. The gift of insight becomes a curse when there is no place for it in the world. But he also believed that, if handled correctly, this perception could become a path to something greater. He saw that these people had the potential not just to suffer, but to transform. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It was a signal that something needed to be done internally, psychologically, spiritually. They needed to build inner structures strong enough to hold what they saw. They needed to learn how to express their perceptions in ways that didn't alienate others, but helped them. They needed to learn when to speak and when to stay silent, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Above all, they needed to understand themselves. To know that they weren't broken or cursed. That their pain came from a gift that society simply didn't know how to hold. Jung called this the integration challenge. It was the lifelong task of bringing what is unconscious into consciousness without being destroyed by it. For the rare individuals with this gift, the challenge was even greater. But so was the possibility. If they could carry the burden without being crushed by it, they could become something extraordinary. Not just mirrors, but healers, visionaries, guides. In the end, Jung didn't believe this kind of perception had to destroy you. But he was clear, it would, unless you learned how to carry it. That was his most dangerous and most powerful discovery. There was once a woman, delicate, quiet, always seeming to carry too much in her eyes. From the moment Carl Jung met her, he knew, this woman saw things that almost nobody else saw. She would enter a room and feel its unspoken mood. She would know who was lying, who hid pain, who harbored grief behind a smile. These perceptions were not vague hunches but precise, uncannily accurate readings of others' hidden emotional lives. She could tell when someone's heart was heavier than their voice let on, or when resentment simmered beneath the laughter. Yet what looked like a gift was becoming something terrible. She could not talk casually. Small talk felt like performing a lie, because she saw through masks. She made friends, but relationships crumpled when others felt exposed. She tried holding down work, but her presence unsettled people, disrupted unspoken norms, because her awareness pierced the facades everyone else lived by. She lived in solitude, not by choice but because of what she saw. Jung came to believe that she did not suffer from illness, she suffered from being too awake. Her perception didn't err, society just could not bear what she revealed. She was an island of awareness in a sea of hidden feelings and ignored truths. Social isolation was one consequence, but more deeply, she felt estranged from her own identity. She sometimes couldn't tell whether what she felt was truly her own, or borrowed from others' emotions. The shadows others could not accept, she absorbed. Her inner world grew crowded with her own hopes and fears, and with those she sensed, but never claimed. Jung called this merging participation mystique. When your boundaries dissolve, when others' emotional content becomes your lived reality, you risk losing yourself. He understood this not simply as loneliness, but as something closer to annihilation of the self, psychological dismantling of identity. It terrified him that someone with such perceptiveness could vanish in their own awareness, swallowed by the reflections of what others refused to see. For this reason, he insisted that perceiving so much without integrating it is not just precarious, it is dangerous. What saved some, he thought, was the fact that perception and consciousness can evolve together. He believed this capacity, this superior perception, must be held with discipline, with ritual, with a structure of inner life strong enough to carry what others cannot bear to see. So the woman was guided toward practices to help her recognize what was hers and what was not. She was urged to spend long, quiet hours alone, to let the echoes of what she sensed settle, to learn to distinguish her own inner voice from the crowded chorus of absorbed emotions. She was invited to explore her own shadows, anger, jealousy, fear. The qualities she saw in others so clearly, the very things that made people recoil from her, were mirrored within her own unconscious. She explored them without shame, gradually integrating those parts so her vision would no longer come at the cost of her wholeness. In time, she learned to engage with others' hidden inner worlds without losing grip on her own. She became a container, someone who could hold another's unspoken sorrow, speak truths that others tried to suppress, without being overwhelmed. She learned humility, the understanding that to see isn't to dominate, but to witness. She offered what she saw not as accusation, but as invitation. Jung watched this pattern in others too. He observed Nietzsche, fierce, prophetic, one who saw with blistering clarity, but who never found the container, and so suffered torment, isolation, despair. He studied mystics like Meister Eckhart, who also saw deeply, but offered their vision in compassion, guiding others gently into awareness, rather than destroying relationships or self in the pursuit of truth alone. Jung himself lived this story. At times, his inner world threatened to consume him, visions, dreams, undercurrents of collective symbols. He thought he might be going mad. Yet he kept working, drawing symbols, reflecting in solitude, writing, talking to people who could see, who could bear some of what he bore. Gradually, he learned to hold the flood of perception with structure, integrity, with friendship and humility. Some days were easier, some days harder. There were moments when the boundaries dissolved, when the isolation rose, when it felt like all that was real in him was what he took in from others. But over time he glimpsed the possibility that seeing too much need not destroy, but could transform. He met people who recognized him, others who had walked similar paths, who understood that seeing what others deny is not madness, but a rare responsibility. Sometimes those people were fellow seekers, mystics, or simply those who did their own inner work. Their presence gave him footing. Their willingness to be known, to ask not to be fixed, but to grow, allowed him to share and not fear exposure. He also saw the traps, when perceiving becomes a burden one wears like armor, when one decides everyone else is too blind to bother with, when being needed becomes the only way to feel real, or when one's perception becomes a permanent protest rather than an offering. These traps could swallow the person even after much integration. But he believed deeply that people with such keen perception, once grounded, once integrated, can act as culture carriers, people whose clarity helps society face what it would rather hide. They can speak truth, reveal shadows, help bring what's unconscious into daylight, not to shame, but to heal. Over the years, Jung's view became hopeful. The woman who once suffered from isolation could become someone bearing light, compassion, authentic presence. It wasn't a simple journey, but a necessary one. Because to refuse to see what hides beneath the surface doesn't stop the hidden from affecting life, it only magnifies collective suffering. And those who see can help prevent that. So the story ends not with destruction, but with transformation. The woman, his patient, would become not a mirror people reject, but a bridge. Not prey to the weight of what she sees, but someone who helps make invisible wounds visible, so healing can begin. Not losing herself in others' shadows, but carrying her light into their darkness without being consumed. In that delicate balance lies what Jung believed was possible, what he believed was vital, not just for her, but for all. In a quiet room overlooking Lake Zurich, Carl Jung sat across from a woman who had come to him in a state of quiet despair. She wasn't hysterical or confused. She was clear, sharp, and unnervingly observant. In fact, that was her problem. She could see things other people didn't. Not just behaviors or words, but the emotions behind them, the lies underneath smiles, the anger buried in silence, the sorrow behind polished appearances. She had no training in psychology, but when she walked into a room, she immediately felt the tension no one named. She heard in someone's voice not just what they were saying, but what they were suppressing. At first, Jung thought this might be imagination or anxiety, but again and again, her insights proved true, often more accurate than what others could admit even to themselves. She had lived her life like this, watching everything, understanding everyone, and slowly falling apart. Relationships didn't last. People grew uncomfortable around her, even hostile. They said she was too intense, too sensitive, too analytical. Jobs didn't last either. Her presence disrupted the unspoken rules that made group life run smoothly. She couldn't play along when things felt false. She didn't want to. And more importantly, she couldn't. The weight of what she saw made her unable to pretend. But the hardest part wasn't others rejecting her. It was the way she had started to lose herself. She absorbed so much from others, unspoken emotions, hidden tensions, unresolved pain, that she could no longer tell what was hers. Was her sadness her own? Was the anxiety she carried coming from within her or picked up from the woman she passed on the street? Her boundaries had dissolved. It felt like she had become an emotional sponge for the unconscious world around her, and it was tearing her apart. Jung didn't diagnose her with a disorder. He didn't see pathology. What he saw in her was what he would come to call differentiated perception, a rare form of awareness where the individual perceives unconscious material in others with striking clarity. She could see what most refused to see. She didn't just read emotions, she absorbed the atmosphere. She lived inside the collective unconscious, whether she wanted to or not. And yet, this gift, so extraordinary in its depth, had become unbearable. Jung began to see a pattern not just in her, but in others. People with this kind of perception, if they didn't understand it or learn to live with it consciously, often suffered greatly. They felt isolated, not just socially, but existentially. It was as if they were living in a reality entirely different from everyone else. Not because they were delusional, but because they saw more. And that kind of vision, when unsupported, becomes a curse. What disturbed Jung most was that history repeated this pattern. Again and again, those who perceived deeply arrived before the rest of the world was ready to understand them. Visionaries, mystics, prophets, artists, they spoke of things that society wasn't yet prepared to hear. Some were dismissed. Others were punished. Many lived alone or broke down under the weight of what they carried. And yet, often decades later, what they saw became common understanding. Their personal insight became cultural transformation. Jung came to believe that these individuals were not misfits or broken souls. They were what he called pioneers of consciousness, people whose psychological development was simply ahead of their time. They experienced, in their own bodies and emotions, what the culture at large would have to face eventually. They were early warning systems, evolutionary instruments, sensing not just personal material but collective problems, climate stress, spiritual emptiness, social disconnection, emotional repression, long before they were named. But their insight came at a cost. If they didn't learn to integrate what they saw, they would drown in it. That woman in 1913 became a turning point for Jung. For 3 years, she worked with him, not to change what she saw, but to relate to it differently. She learned to distinguish what was hers and what belonged to others. She stopped absorbing every emotion that passed through her. She developed inner structure. She no longer needed to speak every truth she saw. She learned discernment. Her perception didn't fade, it grew sharper. But she wasn't overrun by it anymore. In time, she found work as a counselor. Her sensitivity became her tool, not her torment. She found people, though few, who valued what she offered, who weren't afraid of her clarity. She stopped apologizing for what she sensed. And slowly, she came to see that the very thing that had nearly destroyed her was, in fact, her gift. But only after she learned to carry it properly. Jung was transformed by this case. He realized the real danger wasn't the perception itself. The danger was not having the psychological tools to live with it. These people weren't unstable, they were unintegrated. And if they could learn to integrate, they could become exactly what the world needed. But integration was hard. It meant being brutally honest, not just about others, but about oneself. Because often, those who see others' shadows most clearly are haunted by shadows of their own they haven't fully faced. Jung insisted that before one could claimed to be a mirror for the world, they had to look deeply into themselves. Not with shame, but with courage. Only then could they offer reflection without judgment and insight without ego. He warned of pitfalls: becoming inflated, believing you know better than everyone; withdrawing, believing no one is worth engaging with; losing yourself in helping others and forgetting your own inner journey; or collapsing under emotional overwhelm and believing you are too broken to function. But if you could walk through these dangers, if you could develop solitude, do shadow work, build emotional boundaries, seek out true allies, and offer what you see gently, with humility, you could become a bridge between the unconscious and conscious worlds. You would stop being a victim of your insight and begin using it as cultural medicine. Jung studied figures who succeeded in this path, like Meister Eckhart, whose deep intuition turned into teachings that helped others grow. These weren't people who tried to save the world by force. They simply lived what they knew. They saw clearly but acted compassionately. They carried the burden of perception with grace, not martyrdom. Jung believed that people like this could play a vital role in human development. They saw what needed to be integrated before it tore society apart. They sensed when a religion was no longer nourishing souls. They felt when relationships were no longer rooted in truth. They noticed what systems pretended to ignore. And they could guide others quietly, patiently, without judgment, toward deeper awareness. He didn't believe this role required perfection. It required wholeness, being in conscious relationship with one's gifts, one's wounds, and one's humanity. Not to be above others, but to walk alongside, having simply seen a little farther ahead. If you recognize yourself in this story, if you've spent your life seeing what others don't, feeling things too deeply, being told you're too sensitive, too intense, too much, know this: you're not broken. You are early. And that means your path is harder. But it also means you are carrying something incredibly important. The world may not always understand, but it needs what you see. It needs you, not as a martyr, not as a savior, but as a fully developed person who can hold what is unconscious and help bring it gently into the light. This is the heart of Jung's most dangerous discovery, that seeing everything doesn't destroy you. Not seeing yourself clearly within it does. Once you do, your perception becomes not a curse, but a gift that can change the world.